Okay, let's unpack this. You're probably not going to believe this one. The Cuauhtémoc, this huge Mexican Navy sailing ship, it's just run into the Brooklyn Bridge.
Yeah.
I mean, just think about that image for a second. A tall ship, sails and masts, hitting one of New York's biggest icons. It's just...
Yeah, it is. Pretty extraordinary, yeah. A vessel that size, with its history, hitting major infrastructure like the Brooklyn Bridge, it's definitely not something you hear about every day. It makes you immediately ask, how on earth did that happen?
And the first reports, well, they paint a pretty grim picture. This was Saturday evening. We're hearing 2 people tragically died, 19 injured, out of 277 on board. And get this, all 3 masts reportedly snapped right off. This wasn't just like a minor bump. It sounds really, really serious.
It does sound very serious. And when you think about why the ship was here, it adds another layer, doesn't it? This is the training ship for Mexico's heroic naval military school. They were actually on a goodwill tour. Had been visiting New York City, were literally just about to leave, and then this. A huge disruption to their whole mission.
Just unbelievable timing. So, okay, for this deep dive, what we want to do is really get into the details we have so far. We've got these initial reports, and we want to piece together, the sequence of events, understand the human impact, which is significant, and get a sense of the early thinking on what might have caused it.
Precisely. And the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, they're investigating fully now. So we do need to be careful about jumping to conclusions too soon, but we can definitely look at the timeline, the facts that are out there already.
Okay, so let's start right at the moment it happened. Reports say it was just before 8:30 Saturday night, right, on the East River.
That's right. And the Cuauhtémoc, having finished its visit, it should have been heading south, out towards the open sea. But according to city officials, the ship was actually seen moving north, directly towards the Brooklyn Bridge.
Wow, okay, that's a huge deviation right there. That needs looking into.
A critical one, yes.
Yeah. And the videos, I'm sure you've seen some of the bystander footage, it shows these incredibly tall masts just hitting the underside of the bridge. Must have been absolutely terrifying to see that unfold.
And those accounts also mentioned the ship seemed to hit some scaffolding, or maybe like a maintenance gantry that was under the bridge. The impact was apparently forceful enough to make that scaffolding swing quite violently. Gives you a real sense of the energy involved,
Yeah.
A ship that size hitting something solid.
And on the ship itself, chaos, it sounds like. Reports of falling debris, bits of masts, lights rigging everywhere. And the crew, there were those initial understandable reports, maybe in the confusion, about people falling from the mast.
Yes, and it's important we clarify that. While some crew were definitely in very precarious spots, clinging onto ropes or harnesses way up high, those very early reports of people actually falling into the water, thankfully it seems that those were incorrect. Nobody ended up in the river.
Okay, well that's something, at least. Still, the damage to the ship, it's huge. All 3 masts just gone. For a sailing training ship like this, that's fundamental, takes away its main way of moving.
Absolutely. It basically renders the ship unable to operate as it's designed to. On a slightly more positive note, it is a relief that the Brooklyn Bridge itself didn't suffer major structural damage. It was inspected and reopened.
Yeah.
That could have been a whole other level of consequence.
Agreed. Okay, let's talk about the human cost, which is obviously the most heartbreaking part of this whole thing. We know 2 crew members tragically lost their lives.
Yes. America Yamolet Sanchez, she was just 20, from Veracruz, Mexico, and Adal Jair Marcos from Oaxaca, apparently known as Tyson to his friends. The governor of Veracruz, Mexico's president, they both expressed deep sorrow publicly. It's just devastating news.
Truly is. And on top of those terrible losses, 19 others injured. With 5 initially reported in critical condition, that's a lot of people directly impacted by this collision.
It really underscores the sheer force involved and the risks, inherent in operating these large vessels, especially in busy, confined waterways like you find in the major city.
So the big question then, what happened? What caused this? We know the NTSB has launched their investigation. They're saying, a preliminary report in about 30 days?
That's the timeline they've given, yes.
Yeah.
And they are, quite rightly, cautioning everyone against speculating too much right now.
Standard procedure, makes sense.
It is. But we have heard some initial bits and pieces. Mayor Adams, for instance, mentioned a possible mechanical problem, something that might have made the ship veer off course after it left Pier 17.
Okay. And there were also witnesses, right, saying the ship seemed to be moving fast, but in reverse, heading right for the Brooklyn side of the river.
That's been reported, yes. which certainly points towards a vessel not being fully under control.
Yeah.
We also have a bit of a timeline emerging. Apparently, a request for tugboat help went out around 8:24 p.m. The collision happened very shortly after that. NYPD were on scene by about 8:30 p.m.
That's a really tight window between asking for help and the actual impact. Raises questions about how quickly things went wrong.
It does. And there's also a report that the ship's captain told authorities they lost power. And that loss of power resulted in the ship heading towards the Brooklyn abutment. That sounds like a potentially very significant piece of information.
Potentially, yeah. But you mentioned the NTSB.
Right. As of Monday, the NTSB hadn't yet formally interviewed the captain or the crew. So that information about losing power is still preliminary. The full investigation will have to dig much deeper into what kind of power loss, why it happened, and how it affected the ship's ability to steer.
And there's another really stark fact here, isn't there? The height, the Katamok's masts. They're reported at 158 feet tall, but the Brooklyn Bridge clearance, only about 135 feet near the center.
That's a difference of 23 feet.
That's considerable.
It's a critical factor. I mean, even if nothing else went wrong, no power loss, no course deviation, a ship with masts that high simply could not pass under the Brooklyn Bridge safely. It immediately brings up questions about, navigational planning. What were the procedures for a vessel like this with that height operating near the bridge?
Which kind of brings us back to the voyage itself. This whole thing was part of an annual training mission, right? For the cadets from Mexico's naval school. A big deal for them.
Oh, absolutely. It's fundamental to their training, giving them that essential hands-on sea time. And this year's voyage, this is supposed to be huge, 200 days long. Plans to visit 22 ports, 15 countries, places like Jamaica, Cuba, all the way to Scotland, Spain, Iceland, the UK.
Wow.
New York was just one stop on this really extensive journey of training and international diplomacy, really.
And they'd started way back in April from Acapulco, got here to Pier 17 on May 13th. They even had the ship open for public tours for a few days, a real goodwill thing.
Yeah. Exactly. Which makes the contrast with what happened next just so stark and tragic.
Yeah.
And the ship itself, it's not small. Around 297 feet long, 40 feet wide. Maneuvering that in a waterway like the East River, well, it requires real precision. Careful planning.
And their next stop was supposed to be Iceland, continuing that goodwill tour. This accident has just brought all of that to a sudden, very sad halt.
It certainly has. The focus now, understandably, is on the investigation, figuring out exactly what happened, and of course, supporting everyone affected by this awful incident.
So, just to sort of wrap up where we are, we've had this incredibly unexpected, frankly shocking collision. Mexican Navy training ship Katamok hits the Brooklyn Bridge Saturday evening. Tragically, 2 crew members killed, many others injured. The ship itself is heavily damaged, no masts left.
Right.
The bridge thankfully seems okay structurally, but the big question, the cause is still under investigation. Early signs point towards maybe a mechanical failure, maybe loss of power. But that huge height difference between the ship and the bridge, that's also a massive factor that can't be ignored. And this whole training voyage, this goodwill tour, just cut short so tragically.
And, as the NTSB and others do their work, there's still so many unanswered questions.
Yeah.
What exactly was that mechanical issue, if there was one? Did things like the currents or the wind in the East River play any part? And just nailing down that precise sequence of events in those few crucial minutes before impact, that's what they'll be trying to piece together.
Yeah. Which really makes you think, doesn't it? What does an incident like this really tell us about that complex mix? Human actions, machine reliability, and just the basic challenge of sailing these big vessels near, or apparently into, iconic infrastructure in such a busy, dynamic place. It's a really sobering reminder, I think, of how quickly things can go wrong, even when operations seem planned and routine. Makes you pause.